Good afternoon. This is Robert with Hess Consulting, and it is an honor to be back providing another webinar for you guys today. The topic is working your plan, how we can convert strategic planning into a project plan. This is a continuation in our series. So we discussed strategic planning in a previous session, as well as capacity building and a couple of other items related to prevention and the strategic prevention framework. So today is going to build upon some of that, as well as we're going to start off with a quick review. If this is your first time participating with us, I have lots of experience doing lots of different things. There's actually a typo on this slide. It's a CPHQ, not a CPHA. But a lot of my work has been working in prevention as well as in healthcare, approximately 15 years, doing a wider range of different things. I've been independently consulting for the last 10 years, working again with prevention as well as behavioral health, and focusing on social determinants and a lot of the things that we use every day in our prevention work. So hopefully that provides a pool of knowledge from which we're able to draw from. And the company does a number of different things. As you can see, a lot of them are directly related to the strategic prevention framework. And of course, you can check out our website if you're interested in more information. So our learning objectives for today, we're going to do a quick review. And for those of you that participated in our strategic planning session a couple weeks back, hopefully it's not too much duplication. It's going to be a little bit more nuanced. But in order to use your strategic plan as a tool to help you kind of monitor as well as implement your activities, it really needs to be structured in a particular way that facilitates that. So there's going to be a little bit of review. Hopefully it's building upon the foundation that we discussed a couple weeks ago. We're going to look at some, I call them common sense, but it's actually not all that common. So some pragmatic and realistic ways for us to document strategies, as well as reviewing some different approaches. So today should be fairly organic. Again, if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to type them in the chat box as we go through our presentation, and of course I will pause and ask questions, so please make sure you're sitting near your keyboard because it definitely helps with the engagement as we proceed today. So quick review, and again, we talked about some of this a couple weeks ago, and the strategic planning training is posted on YouTube. So if for whatever reason you are not able to participate with us, we can get you a link and you can go back and watch that. But so when thinking about strategic planning, it's important to think about the who, because the who also helps for us to identify who will be executing the activities that are around the table. And we want to make sure that all of those roles are kind of lined up. So identifying who needs to participate in strategic planning is a really important process. Of course, again, we touched on this in previous sessions, making sure that they have different ways to participate if they're not able to participate in person. And we've talked about the value of the level setting meeting, but again, just making sure that all of the parties that are participating in strategic planning have an opportunity to understand the current lay of the land via your needs assessment, if you've decided to do any additional focus groups, key informant interviews, data analysis, literature review, any of those types of things. And all of that's important because, again, those are the things that are going to be driving your actual strategies and the types of things that you're going to do. We don't know what we don't know, and so we're certainly not going to create strategies to do things that we don't know need to be done. And as we translate our strategic planning session and ideas and brainstorming and all the things we've talked about previously into a tangible document, these are the logistics and the components that make the document useful and as a living, breathing tool that is going to help us. So I know we spent a lot of time talking about this level setting meeting, but again, it's really critical in the process to make sure that all the members around the table are familiar with the lay of the land, because that is also going to help with your stakeholder analysis, identifying not just what will be done, but how it will be done, when it will be done, by whom it will be done, and also who else needs to be involved in the process. So For example, if you need authorization from someone, or even if you need kind of to pull political weight or support, garner support from a key stakeholder or a gatekeeper in a particular community, getting their input in the process ahead of time is going to be really helpful. So of course, we've talked about this level setting meeting. You want to make sure you have a facilitator if possible. You want to review the history, mission, values of the organization. You want to understand your regulatory and contractual requirements. And then, of course, the most critical part is reviewing findings from your needs assessment, and specifically any gap analysis, readiness assessments, your SWOT analysis. And included in this, I would also say your stakeholder analysis, which I didn't include on the slide, but that is an important part. Getting down to, again, kind of the who will be doing these things. So ultimately, one of the things that we want to think about as we are transitioning our wonderful brainstorming session into a document that we need to utilize and leverage on a daily basis is keeping things simple. And I'm sure some folks may have heard different analogies. So KISS, the KISS, some people say keep it simple, stupid. I always say keep it simple, silly, so that's not so insulting. But really wanting to make sure that when we are framing our strategies, do we know what they actually mean? Like when we operationalize them, do folks understand what is it that we're actually saying that we're going to be doing? Because again, if you kind of have this very abstract, philosophical, conceptual, strategic plan, which I definitely have seen and have worked with, it's very easy for folks to misinterpret what it means. It's very easy for folks to not have real concrete, clear understanding of the work that needs to be done, which ultimately means that things don't get done. And if folks are not super duper clear on, the not just the wording, because semantics, people can debate semantics all day long, but on the meaning and the actual action steps in your strategic planner, then that's where a lot of organizations go wrong. So again, we talked previously, about some facilitation strategies, and we talked about, ranking and how do we do decision making in a previous presentation, and all of those things you want to kind of reflect back to and think about what the end product looks like. And ultimately, if in your brainstorming session and in your kind of prioritization or decision-making sessions around, okay, so we've come up with 25 ideas, that's way too robust, we're all volunteers. What are we actually going to do in an effort to keep it simple? What are we actually going to do? You want to look at that list and really think about feasibility. Aiming for low-hanging fruit is always a good strategy. So looking at what can we quickly do or what won't take a whole lot of resources for us, and thinking about even the planning that goes into a process or into an activity. Not just, of course, not just financial resources, but recognizing your human capital and all of the things, how much to what extent would you need to exhaust your relationships with stakeholders? If we needed, if we had a really big ask from, say, the mayor, and we wanted to put in or pass a city ordinance to restrict underage drinking on the weekends by implementing a neighborhood curfew. That's a really big ask, and so we wouldn't want all of our strategies to be asking the mayor to do 20 things for us when we really just need her to do one thing for us. And being cognizant of those types of resource allocations related to the strategies that we're doing. So again, I hope I'm helping to connect all of the thoughtfulness that needs to go into strategic planning. And in the previous session when we talked about it, it was a lot of kind of the tools that would be used to facilitate strategic planning as well as decision making. And this conversation is focusing a little bit more on some of the strategy behind selecting and identifying kind of your activities and the things that you're going to actually do within your strategic plan. So one of the things that is, as you're kind of thinking this through and having that conversation with your group, with your coalition, within your organization, with your board of directors, whomever it is that's participating in strategic planning, of course, I think that, again, these are facilitation tools, but they really do help when we are now trying to operationalize our strategic plan. And this goes even into the activities that make it on the final document. And I've done this multiple times where you write your kind of like core strategies. So maybe we land on 2 to 3 things that we are absolutely going to tackle and make sure that we happen. But then there's all these other ideas that we had, right? All of the really, maybe they were too resource intensive, or, and we're going to talk about kind of sequencing of events in a little minute, but maybe, we can't really tackle item B until we tackle item A. And we don't know how item A is going to go. And so until we're able to see if we can get this, city ordinance passed, as I was using previously as an example, we can't really talk through, the increased patrol and increased funding allocation of police officers or whomever it is that we're going to use, student resource officers or neighborhood watch programs, et cetera, to help enforce this law or this new city ordinance. And so we can use parking lots even in our strategic plan, or they're items that we can kind of put in there as to be determined, or even leaving the date of those items to be. I've actually written strategic plans that were intended for a year, but we documented things that we wanted to do in the following year because we needed to get A, B, and C done before we could do D, E, and F. And so, but we didn't want to lose sight of what was going to be in the pipeline for the next year. So we still documented it, put it on the plan, and actually we were able to get A, B, and C done faster than anticipated. So we were able to then tackle D, E, and F within that same 1 year period of time. And so the parking lot is really important. Deep dives in your strategic planning facilitation process really help to get into the clarification and the nuances about your activity. So there's a couple of levels and points in time in which deep dives are really important. So what I mean by this is when you ask a lot of probing questions. So someone comes up with an idea and folks are really receptive to it around the table. And what we want to make sure is that everyone has the same understanding of what this really great idea is. And so as I described, let's talk about enforcement of underage drinking. And so we want to write a policy around underage drinking. So deep diving on this topic would include, well, what does it look like? At what level are we wanting to write this policy? Of course, you could attempt to submit a state level policy and get legislatures from your state Senate and your state House of representatives to try to pass something. You could also attempt to get a city ordinance passed and do like a formal city, like a law at the city level or the county level, whatever's most appropriate. Or you could do something that's a little less formal, and maybe it's a neighborhood block watch, and you as your neighbors or your neighbors association, you get them to pass something, your neighborhood association. So, asking those types of questions are really helpful because they then help identify, well, who's going to be your champion for this? And you start teasing that out in this deep dive. You go and essentially, here we have an example or a picture of a scuba diver. And so you think about a scuba diver in the ocean, there's lots of things going on in the ocean. And so it's their job to get down there and explore the nuances and pick up rocks and turn them over and see what's happening and what's meant by that. And maybe they find new creatures and exploring it. And so using the deep dive process, you get into, okay, well, how would we operationalize that? And who would be our champions? What resources would it take for us to do it? And you would do all of this in your strategic planning session, and or, in a follow-up process. Maybe at the planning session, you just decide, okay, we're going to do this ordinance, we're going to assign a work group, and the work group's going to figure out the details. But at some point, all those details need to happen, and all of those details need to be written down. And so you can see here on the right-hand side, our little hint is that deep dive should always look and identify, a person responsible, and should order and prioritize activities. And so we're going to talk about sequencing of activities quite a bit today, because it's one of the really important tools and components that's necessary for your strategic plan to result and be effective as a project plan or as a tool that you're able to use. But you need to think about that. It's kind of like putting the cart before the horse, so to speak. All that has to be in your head as you're working on facilitating strategic planning and starting to identify, at least who's going to be responsible for this. And then, of course, those people can work on identifying the nuanced details and really getting into that deep dive. So I'm going to take a quick pause. I almost feel like I talked in a little bit of circles. And so I want to pause and see if that was clear to folks. If you guys have any questions so far about the things that we need to think about while facilitating strategic planning that will help us in the long run or down the road to actually use our plan in a constructive, meaningful way. So if you have any questions, why don't you give me a second to catch my breath and type them in the chat box for me. Or if you think that this is the greatest presentation you've ever seen in your life and has answered everything potentially possible, go ahead and say yes for me, or send me a smiley face, or give me some type of reaction in the chat box. All right. Oh man, you guys make me feel so good. Thank you. Okay. So, we're doing a lot of kind of framing and setting ourselves up to really utilize our strategic plan session and the facilitation of the strategic planning to help us in the long run. And these are kind of those secrets and hints or whatever that are going to make it really helpful. So to kind of do a quick review, because we're about to convert to some really specific things and some real specific nuances. So quick review. Want to make sure, of course, that you have all the right people in the room, that everyone's on the same page through level setting, and that while you're facilitating strategic planning, that you want to talk through the nuances of what it is that you're anticipating will be on your plan. So, of course, as we described in the previous slide, keeping it simple, looking for those quick wins, identifying and thinking about your relationships with people and the resources that you're going to take. There are things that may end up later on down the road because they're either not quick wins, or you don't have the relationship in place or the resources to be able to pull it off, and that's okay. And then there are other things that the team is on board with that we need to do a deep dive in to operationalize it and get to the nuances of activities and those things. So as we're structuring our strategic plan, now I will say, and I'm sure that anyone that's been in this field or in a professional setting for a period of time, you've probably seen a dozen or more different formats for a strategic plan. And I have probably seen 100 different formats and structures. Everyone does it differently. And some people really focus on aesthetics and making it real pretty. And other people focus on real specific details and making it really nuanced. And all of that is okay. It's really up to you. Unless your regulator, whoever's funding your project or authorizing it, has a specific template that they want to use. I say, explore your options and do what works for you. What I'm going to advocate for today, though, is making sure that it includes at a minimum the components that are going to help you be successful at operationalizing all the stuff that you're talking about and that you're planning to do. So at a minimum, you're probably going to have, and I'm going to go through this little template, and I'll throw out some examples and terms that I'm sure you guys are familiar with, and hopefully there may be some new things as well. So most people are very familiar with goals, kind of the big picture. What is it that we're wanting to accomplish? And that's our first column. Of course, in order for this to be practical, you want to limit the number of goals that you have. Typically, what I tell people and what people have taught me is, 3 goals is probably enough. If you're doing anything more than that, it's going to be real difficult to manage. And if you're doing, you can of course do less than that, but 3 is a good number to shoot for in the goal arena, because those goals are going to have a number of things and lots of work underneath them to accomplish them. So if goal number 1 is to implement a city ordinance to reduce, underage drinking on the evenings and weekends, that's easy. That's great. We can make that happen. Goal number 2 is increase awareness about underage drinking in our neighborhood. And maybe we have to do that first. Maybe we need to create awareness in our community before we're able to implement this policy. And goal number 3 would be to increase knowledge of, to train law enforcement officers on signs and symptoms of underage drinking, as well as resources to keep kids out of incarceration, but into rehabilitation or detox programs. So all 3 of those things work together. They're all targeting underage drinking, and there's lots of ways the activities and the work underneath them will make sense and flow together. So some people would have goals and then strategies, or goals and then objectives, or goals and then objectives, then strategies. Or, I think we talked about this in our strategic planning training a couple of weeks ago, is, goals, objectives, strategies, activities, all of them. There's different ways you can structure them. I'm going to just focus on goals and then the activities that are going to be executed to support those goals. And if you want to include objectives and or strategies in between these 2, then that's totally fine and up to you. But activities are kind of the lowest level in this tier, and they are literally the work that's going to be done. So of course you can write those at whatever level of granularity that you want to. If the goal is to pass a city ordinance, maybe your activities include get the mayor on board. So you can write just get the mayor on board, or you can write the mayor an email asking for a meeting, buy the mayor coffee. You can just you can go to whatever level of granularity that you would like to. But activities are the lowest level of the work that's going to be done. The inputs, of course, are the resources that it's going to take. If your activity is meet the mayor, if you want to get real nuanced, or if your regulator requires it, then of course your inputs include your phone and time and maybe mileage to drive over there. But if it's something like that, I oftentimes leave the inputs column blank, because those are kind of supports, or they're ancillary overhead types of things, general costs. And of course you can itemize them if you would like to, but that's really up to you and the type of granularity that's required of you by your regulator or funder, as well as your own level of organization and oversight. However, if your objective is to implement a new centralized resource system that's going to require databasing and development time and a website, those are really practical inputs that have costs associated with them that you need to think through. And of course, those are sizable enough that you definitely want to consider them. And so the inputs is something that's really important, because of course, you can't launch a new website if you don't have a developer on board. And so that helps you to identify the sequencing, like we're going to talk about, of your activities. Person responsible, pretty straightforward. Sometimes, of course, if you're using like a subcommittee and they're in charge of it, just write subcommittee. Or if you feel like you need to write an individual's name, that's fine as well. Either one works depending on, again, your level of oversight. Due date, really important. This is going to help with sequencing. One thing that I typically don't do, but I probably should have included it for the sake of today's conversation, is actually looking at start date and end date. Because when we talk about sequencing, and there's a whole slide about this, but understanding kind of the lead time, if it's something as simple as a meeting, well, your start date and end date are like an hour apart from one another because you're going to start the meeting and end the meeting. But if it's building a website and you have this whole process assigned to it of like identifying and recruiting a developer, having a brainstorming session, developing all the content, the actual time of like coding and building the website, like you might need to know that it's going to take at least 3 months to get that off the ground. So you can't promise tomorrow, that it's just going to be up and ready. And if you just have the due date, you don't really have the ability to appreciate the lead time it takes to actually launch the website. Whereas if you have a start date and end date, you're able to do that. We'll talk about sequencing again in a minute. Current progress is really important from like a meeting perspective, as well as for you to track your progress towards the goal. So again, if you have an activity that is going to take an entire year to make happen, you're writing a new curriculum that's going to be rolled out. So the end date just says December 31st. Well, that's real far away, so it doesn't seem like it's all that important. But if you know that it's going to take 9 months or 12 months of lead time to do that, and here we are now March 15th, so we should be approximately 33% of the way through that project, and we're only 5% of the way through that project. Again, it has a 12-month lead time. It's a quarter. We're about to wrap up the first quarter of the year. And so, we're behind. So that then gives us the data to say, hey, we need to start focusing on developing this curriculum based off of that current progress. And then, of course, your outcomes are another thing that from a strategic plan perspective, you want to track and monitor. And that can be, your data, if those are the variables that you're tracking, if it's part of an outcomes evaluation. So if we're building this website for resources and the outcome is that we're connecting people to resources, how are we going to measure that and making sure that that is included on the progress plan so we can track it. So I know I'm hoping that some of that was pretty intuitive. And I did want to ask, if there are other components or things that you guys are used to seeing on a strategic plan that will help as we consider using it as like a daily tool to guide our work. So pull out your keyboards for me one more time and let me know if these are kind of standard. Go ahead and just type standard. If some of these are new to you, type some are new to me. Or if there are other things that are not on here that you're used to seeing, then please type whatever those might be. Maybe you are used to seeing those start dates and end dates, and that's it's worrisome to you that it's not on here because I forgot to add the column. All right, looks like this is all good. Looks like this is stuff that you guys are used to seeing. So I think I already talked through this, so I kind of am not going to talk through that again. That's just some definitions. So when we're talking about these goals, we want to think through, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but thinking about those resources. And I think that we did a whole session on capacity building. And as I mentioned, this is actually why I like to put capacity building ahead of implementation, ahead of planning. So the typical strategic prevention framework goes from assessment, capacity building, planning, implementation, whereas I like to flip it and say assessment, planning, capacity building, implementation, because of this exact question. Once you know what you're wanting to do, function drives form of your organization. So once you know that what you're wanting to do, then you identify your gaps, and you start looking at what resources you need that you currently have compared to resources you need that you don't currently have, and looking at how we will obtain them. And so some of those things will go back into your strategic plan. So again, using the analogy of building a website, if you're sitting around the room and no one around the room is a web developer, then now you know what you need to do. And so maybe some of your activities will be to recruit a web developer. And that can be a process in and of itself, and that can take several weeks. So the lead time associated with that can become really integral to the success of your launch, especially your timeline. And so you obviously don't want to tell your regulator you're going to have a website up next week if, of course, you don't have a web developer, or are not aware of the amount of time that it can take to build a website. So understanding those resources are really, really important. So when we talk about operationalizing our goals, and again, I'm not going to go into any more detail about this because we talked about it quite a bit. But again, the activity level is where we're going to focus, or at least where all of the work happens. And so activities are what then translate themselves onto your meeting agendas and onto the conversation that you're going to be tracking and monitoring for progress. And so again, thinking back through when you're facilitating strategic planning, making sure that your goals, and if you're going to use objectives and or strategies as well, making sure that those are clear enough and detailed enough so that your team can identify the activities that need to be done to achieve and accomplish those goals, strategies, and objectives, because those activities are what you're going to be tracking on a day-to-day basis. And of course, I know we've spent a lot of time previously talking about SMART goals, so making sure that they're specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound or limited. There's a couple of adaptations to the acronym SMART, so if you've heard that used in a different way, it's all inherently the same, but some of the words in the acronym do get bounced around depending on how you were trained on it. So, and we talked about this as well. So as you've gone through facilitating strategic planning, and you've done your deep dives, and you've operationalized your goals, and you've gotten down to that activity level, you're going to take all this information. And again, some folks do this all in one strategic planning session. They'll actually get down to this level of detail. I've also done it when the strategic planning session identified the goals and strategies, and then afterwards we divided it up and formed, depending on what those goals and strategies were, we created work groups around each of those topics. And then in meetings over the next 2 weeks or a month, the work groups identified all the activities. So, again, you can kind of facilitate that however you want to, but the point is you take all your information and you roll it into this plan. And so you create this draft. And then, of course, you review the draft together as a coalition or as an organization or a board, whomever it is that's kind of responsible to execute or develop your strategic plan, and then you finalize it. And of course, you finalize it however you want to, via formal vote or informal consensus, or again, it can be authoritative decision if you're a one-man shop or you have a real strong president of the board or president of the organization. You are welcome to do that, or if you have a CEO who's in charge of it, etc. So now we're going to translate it and start using this plan, right? The plan is written, it's set in, well, it's not set in stone, but it's written for the year. And of course, things can be updated and changed, and I highly encourage you to update and change things as they need to be. But you really want to use your strategic plan to form or to organize, drive the formation of your coalition or your organization. So again, depending on what it is that your goals are, remember your goals are informed by the needs of your community. So you've just spent all of this time reviewing and assessing the needs in your community, and those inform these strategies. And this is probably one of the hardest things for people to do because it requires so much flexibility and adaptation. So someone who may have been in charge, the head of research, because you were doing a needs assessment, well, maybe we're no longer doing a needs assessment and now we need a program manager because we're launching, this new curriculum, or now we need, a marketing person because we're doing this education and awareness campaign and we weren't doing that last year. So their roles may change, roles may be eliminated, new roles may be created, and those human dynamics of, people's, how do I say this? Their sense of self, their sense of contribution, their role within the community or within the coalition, and all the pride that may come with that, and sense of worth even that comes with that. All that needs to be navigated, and I highly encourage taking the time to be very thoughtful about that and making sure that those leaders that have been participating in your organization or coalition in previous years are really on board with kind of these changes, because they might not be the co-chair of the perfect work group, or they might not be the person that gets to stand in front of a crowd anymore. And for some people, that is a significant motivator and is really important to them. So there may be some things to navigate there. But so now that you've reorganized your coalition, you're going to use your strategic plan to inform your fundraising activities. So, again, we've decided we're going to, create this website. The website's going to cost $40,000 to do correctly, which is actually cheap for a website because they can get much more expensive than that. And so, in order to do it correctly, we need to do some fundraising. And so now you have your strategic plan to drive your fundraising activities. And your strategic plan also becomes kind of the facilitator, precipitator of your agendas for all of your meetings. So I'm an advocate of this. Not everyone enjoys me because I'm such a strong advocate of this. But on every single agenda that I have ever facilitated, there is a review, revise of the project plan, or in this case, the strategic plan, to say, or as kind of like a level setter to start off the meeting. We're going to review, what are we doing? What did we say we were going to do this year? Where are we at with it? And that's where those columns, that we talked about previously, let's go back and look at it. So here we go. So looking at, we said we were going to reduce underage drinking among African American students ages 15 to 18 in Mojave County, which is a county in Arizona. And so we said that to do that, we were going to provide school-based education to 100 students, and that's going to require 4 hours of training. And look, we've already accomplished that. That's great. And we were able to increase knowledge by 25%. But we also said that we're going to do 10 hours of training for trainers, and we've not gotten there yet. So, in literally sitting in our meeting, we're able to talk through the barriers to this. This is going to be on the agenda to talk through with the trainers what's happening. Is it curriculum? Are there problems that need to be troubleshooted? Are there new resources that need to be allocated? Maybe someone went on maternity leave, because that happens, or someone's sick, or they're traveling. All of these little barriers are the things, nuances that keep us from actually being successful and actually accomplishing our goals. So by reinforcing and revisiting, what did we say we were going to do in every meeting? And of course, when I say every meeting, I mean like coalition meetings, which may happen every 2 weeks or once a month, or once a quarter, however it is that you have yourself structured. But I would also recommend, that if you've kind of tease things out by work groups or by subcommittees, or however you have things structured, that they are also pulling out their piece of this plan whenever they're meeting to have those same conversations. And of course, based off of your structure, maybe they're just reporting out at kind of the big committee meeting or coalition meeting, because the work groups have been meeting, twice a week for the last 6 months on this to make sure that they get it done. But the point is that the plan is reviewed and it's on the agenda, and then as things need to get adjusted or updated, that they are, and you're able to mitigate barriers and talk through what's happening and why it's happening, and decisions that come up. And we're going to talk about a couple of other tools that can be used to drive this process as well. Okay, so I think we covered that. Um, so another tool that can be used, and I'm sure some folks are very familiar with this, and I'm using this as an incredibly nuanced and detailed example of a Gantt chart. So for those of you that may not be familiar in project management, a Gantt chart is a sequenced series of activities. And you can see, or at least I hope you can see, I'm going to try and zoom in so that you can get it as big as possible, that on the Gantt chart, of course, you have your project name and today's date and all of that stuff, and that's fine. But what you'll see in these first couple of columns, the gray category is really kind of your goals or objectives. So like, what are we doing to accomplish this? So if the goal or objective is website. So the gray shaded area would be website, and then under that would be all of the things that come into play in order to get the website developed. You see the task lead is on there, so again, that's the person responsible. Here's why and where you would use that start date and the end date, and we'll talk through that. Very formally, you would count, if it's a 3-month lead time, then you would see the duration is 90 days. That's the 3 months. Your percent complete is going to be really important. And then these next 3 columns, you have to be a really obsessive compulsive project manager, which I'm a certified project manager, and I've worked with a lot of certified project managers. And some people really enjoy these next 3 columns. I personally don't use them, but that's up to you to decide. And then so this next, the right hand side is really kind of it's the visualization of your leads and lags and your duration. So you see the start date here is January 3rd, 2009. The end date is March 18th, 2009. So this bar runs from the beginning of January to the middle of March, and that tells you, how long that particular activity or task takes. And so you're able to visualize kind of the major components, or well, in this example, the detailed nuances of when things need to start and stop, and when the different activities happen. So I wanted to offer this as an incredibly detailed version. And again, if you are interested in studying project management, I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic skill to have, and you'll learn a lot of other tools. But I'm proposing this as one option, and then a more simple version, which is the one that I actually use. Now, the Gantt chart, this is the exact same concept as the previous slide, except it's much more simple. And part of it is, again, you can see I'm only focusing on the activities. So this first column is just the activities. Of course, if you wanted to add in your goals and objectives, that's totally fine as well. And the timelines that I'm using, I chose months because, this isn't construction. We're not building a house where, we need to know that the plumber's coming in at 2 p.m. because the framer has to be gone by then. And those details, those like real specific nuanced details really, really matter. In my experience, the type of work that we're doing is at least on a week-to-week basis, but even still, month-to-month seems to be a totally appropriate kind of conceptual time frame to kind of track our activities. But you can decide if you wanted to do something that is a little bit more detailed. That's totally fine. But the point of this and the value to me in prevention work and as a project manager and as someone who's using a strategic plan as a tool is to really understand the relationships between these activities. And that's where you see here at the bottom of the slide, where we're talking about the 4 different types of activities. And this is from like a sequencing perspective. So there's finish to start activities, which is the most common type of relationship. So the predecessor activity must finish before the successor activity can begin. I deleted all the examples because I didn't have enough space. But we can see here that activity 2 must finish, if theoretically, before activity 3 can begin. And so it's important to know whatever those might be, because again, as we're thinking through our activities and when they're going to happen, in what order, and anything that may stall our project or our strategic plan from being successful that year, we need to understand what needs to happen before another thing can happen. Uh, and so then there's finish to finish. So the predecessor activity must finish before the successor activity can finish. And so we can see, theoretically, activity 1 and 2 could have this relationship. So maybe I need to, finish writing the grant proposal before I can write the executive summary of the grant proposal. I might be able to tease it out. I can pull out some of the content based off of the draft and the information, so I don't need to wait for the grant proposal to be written for me to start the executive summary, but I do need to wait for the grant proposal to be finished in order for me to finish the executive summary. Then there's start to start. So the predecessor activity must start before the successor activity can start. And so we can see again 1 and 2 theoretically. Maybe activity 1 needs to start before activity 2 can start. And there's probably a lot of really good examples that for whatever reason my mind is just blanking on me right now, so forgive me. Just use your chat box. Does anyone have a good example of what a start to start might need to be? Like an example of what a start to start relationship might look like? Go ahead and type in the chat box for me. I'll take a second and pause. No one? All right. Well, maybe you have decided that you need to start your dinner before you eat dessert, but you don't need to finish your dinner before you eat dessert. And I've done that many times. And then there's the start to finish relationship, which again is the least common. Oh, shoot. I don't know why says exam. That's interesting. But the successor activity has to start before the predecessor activity can finish. And so again, you need to, a relay race would be a great way to kind of talk this through. And so the next runner has to, get going before the last runner can stop in that baton handoff stage. You want the next runner to start running before you stop running, because otherwise you're not going to get that baton passed off. So understanding these relationships and thinking them through as you're planning out your activities. Again, this is a nuance that's really going to help you to be successful. So the last slide that we have is another tool that I use really often, and I just recently encountered a project where the whole team was this was a real foreign concept to them, and so I wanted to make sure that I shared it with you guys because it's something I find incredibly helpful. And so as you are going through your meetings, so you've completed your strategic plan, you are working your plan every week or every month, whenever your group gets together, you have your plan out and you are plowing through it, and you have your events and activities sequenced appropriately, and everything's flying smoothly. But then someone asks a question, and maybe the wrong person or the person that needs to answer the question is not in the room, or because there's a risk that comes up, something's running behind, and again, we have those kind of finish to start relationship. So activity 1 needs to finish before activity 2 can start, and we have a deadline that's coming up, and of course we're going to be talking about this at the next meeting, and so someone's going to ask, why is it delayed, and we need to have an understanding of that. And so your project coordinator or facilitator or project manager or whomever it is, even if it's the chair of the committees, when they're meeting and they're taking minutes, which is an assumption that they're taking minutes, and if they're not taking minutes, please ask them to take minutes. But there's another tool that I often use, which is a RAID Q log. And so RAID Q stands for risks, assumptions, issues, dependencies, and the Q is questions. And in essence, And this is, I keep this as a tab in my project plan, which is why I'm bringing it up today, is that as we're meeting and as people are going through and discussing progress and stuff, risks are going to come up. You know, maybe the facilitator for the training that or the curriculum that we wanted to use, there's a risk that we're not going to be able to get the license to use it, or a risk that we're not going to be able to afford a facilitator to come out and train. Those are risks. And so we use the log to describe, which is that first column, whatever it is, whatever the situation is. The type is just identifying or classifying it as a risk, assumption, issue, dependency, or question. And then, who's asking or who's presenting this issue and when was it presented. And this tool then becomes a literal log that can have, 300 lines on it if you would like to, that helps present those issues back to kind of the broader committee, and helps to facilitate the sharing and translation of not only knowledge, but then also kind of the key decisions that have taken place throughout the course of your annual strategic plan. And so as new people come on board and they're getting oriented to the things that are going on, maybe they'll come up with, similar questions or similar ideas or similar concerns that may be risks or assumptions. And this then becomes a tool that you're able to reflect people back to or turn them back to and say, oh yeah, we talked about that back in January, and we collectively decided that this is what we were going to do. And so the nuance here that makes this special or different than just meeting minutes or anything like that is this is tied specifically to your project plan, and so it's related to the activities that are documented on your plan. And as you go through them, as you're sitting in a subcommittee meeting where only 2 people showed up, and you're talking about progress with the web developer, and there are some real specific questions over what content we want or how many pages we want, on this website, or those types of things. You're able to document them, and then the log gets shared back to the larger committee, whether it be the full coalition or an executive committee or whomever it is that needs to make a decision on it. And you're able to track and document those decisions or those resolutions. And again, it then becomes a source, kind of a centralized source for other folks that as they have questions and they're able to come back and visit it. So I think the template's pretty self-explanatory. So a description of whatever the risk, assumption, issue, dependency, or question is. You can organize it and classify it by type. So typically I just throw a drop down in here, type that in there. Who was asking or who was bringing it up, when it was submitted on, so the date, and then whatever the final decision was. Of course, who resolved it. So if there's a single point of contact that is able to answer that question, fantastic. If it's the whole group that needs to talk about it and make a collective decision, then that's fine too. And when it was resolved. And again, I really wanted to offer this as a tool that I find to be incredibly helpful, and that I use very often. And as you're using your strategic plan as a project plan, this is a complementary tool that you can use to help facilitate progress as you move forward. So we have reached the conclusion for today. So before we adjourn, I want to first open it up for questions. And so if you have a question or comment even, how about this? If you have a question, please type it down in the chat box. If you don't have a question, tell me one thing that you enjoyed or learned about today, just because I really want to stimulate some interaction. While you guys are all typing either your question or one thing that you learned today, if you have not already, please make sure that you jot down this survey link because you need to fill out your evaluation of today's session. And so I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this link for you in the chat box so that you can use that. You do need to complete a training evaluation within 48 hours to receive credit. And so if you would go ahead and do that. If you're in a group, if there's more of you sitting in a computer, go ahead and someone email that out to the folks in the room because I think that that will help folks. And then, of course, You have my email address and my cell phone number. Both of those come directly to me. So if there are additional questions or things that you need, please feel free to reach out via email or phone call. Awesome. I'm glad that you guys liked the RAID Q log. That's really great. And I hope that those templates were helpful. Again, there's lots of ways to format things. And so I hope that it gives you some creative ideas. A lot of this, there's not a prescriptive one way, unless your regulator or funder is telling you that there is a way that they want you to do it. There's lots of adaptive ways for you to do it. So hopefully that is helpful. Awesome. Well, I'm not seeing any questions, so I will go ahead and adjourn for today. Thank you guys so much. I hope you all have a fantastic afternoon.